Welcome. My name is Hugh Long. I am the president of the Board of Trustees of the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra and also a member of the League Board. Welcome to the Toolbox session, a conversation with Robert Flanagan. This session is a continuation of what Jesse expressed as one of the main conference themes this morning, a civil and candid dialogue around tough issues. And as backdrop, I wanted to share with those of you who weren't there at the time, and there are some people here who were there at the time, in May of 2003, a little over 9 years ago, a collection of musicians and staff and trustees from more than a dozen orchestras were in a meeting convened by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation discussing issues related to orchestral culture and governance. To take you back to that moment in time, the dot-com bubble had burst. The economy was in recession. Orchestras' fiscal positions were under significant stress. And one evening, a group of us, admittedly in a bar, and as I mentioned, some of those folks are here at conference, suggested that around this discussion of culture and governance, that there was an elephant in the middle of the living room. And we identified that elephant rather directly as the shitty economy. And at the time, we thought it was about as bad as it was going to get. I hesitate to speculate as to what adjective we would put in front of the word economy if we were having that meeting today, as we sit in the Great Recession, although officially it's over, right?
Yeah, the trough has been passed.
Right. But as a result of the suggestion that we address the elephant in the room, we embarked on a journey to try to define the economic circumstances of the orchestral field in the United States. And that in turn led us to asking Bob Flanagan to bring some professional economic expertise to that journey. Bob's book, The Perilous Life of Symphony Orchestras, short commercial announcement you have on your tables if you haven't already obtained and read the book, and I know all but 2 or 3 of you in the room have. Here's a discount form to enable you to get a 20% reduction in the price from Yale University Press. But this book, which evolved from a variety of investigations and studies and preliminary reports, is an important way station on this journey to understand these economics. Bob is the Konosuke Matsushita Professor of International Labor Economics and Policy Analysis at Stanford University. Bob is Emeritus. I was kidding him earlier, when you go on the Stanford website, after the word emeritus is the word recall. I said, is that like in the product market? Something went wrong with the automobile? And he assured me that it was an incomplete description. It's recalled to service. And Bob is in fact actively engaged in that portion of academic responsibilities that he enjoys, which is teaching some specific courses and finishing up on some research projects. And he tells me that, you know, something that I might look forward to someday is not having to go to faculty meetings. Bob did his undergraduate work in economics at Yale. As I told him earlier, he saw the error of his ways of being on the East Coast and headed to California and did his master's and doctoral work at UC Berkeley. A couple of minor detours as senior economic staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors, a faculty appointment at Chicago University, and then came back west and also understood that while Berkeley was better than Yale, Stanford was best of all, and joined the faculty of Stanford University in 1975. The other thing you need to know about Bob is that at the age of 3, he began playing the clarinet. And for the last 30 years has been playing clarinet and saxophone in a big band jazz orchestra that plays gigs all over the San Francisco Bay Area. So it was with great pleasure that I introduce you to Bob Flanagan, who will take us through a brief overview of the perilous life of symphony orchestras. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hugh, and I want to say what a pleasure it is to be able to discuss some of the findings in the study with a group as well-informed as this is. The point of departure for the study that I'm discussing today is what I see as a basic paradox in symphonic music. On the one hand, it's never been performed better than it is performed today, and yet the finances of most symphony orchestras are fragile. And indeed, as I looked around the world at the economics of symphony orchestras, I found that there's no symphony orchestra that earns enough from its performances, from its recordings, broadcasts, to cover its performance expenses. So in a nutshell, the purpose of my study and talk today is to investigate why that is the case and what can be done about it. The study, for the benefit of those who haven't seen the book or Jesse Rosen's write-up on it, uses OSR data that you diligently provide annually to the League, supplements it with some government data on the economic base of the communities in which symphonies are located, and also some data on the economics of operas in a small effort to explore competition between the performing arts. I want to stress that it's an industry study, a study of forces that affect the industry generally. You will not find comments or analyses using the League data on any specific symphony orchestra. What I'm going to do today is focus on what I see 4 key ideas that should inform actions by symphony orchestras during their discussions of specific policy actions. And these 4 ideas come out, and I think are some of the more important broad ideas come out of the study. The first thing I want to go into is a distinction between cyclical and structural deficits. A distinction which is as recently as 4 or 5 years ago was not widely appreciated, it seemed, within the symphony community. Cyclical deficits was what Hugh was just describing when he mentioned, to quote him directly, a shitty economy. I think of cyclical deficits as the economic weather. They're a temporary consequence of economic recessions. The good news is they're reversible, but only really reversible by government macroeconomic policies. There are little that symphonies individually can do to affect the basic economic condition in the country. Recessions worsen orchestra's financial balance because performance revenues decline more rapidly in a recession than expenses. and then conversely in an expansion when the revenues pick up more rapidly than expansion. The result then is a cyclical movement of the deficit. Orchestras look to non-performance income to cover their deficits, but just when they need it most in a recession, it declines as well because the individuals, businesses, and others who provide non-performance income are having their own economic troubles and are less able to afford it. That's about all I want to say about cyclical deficits. The other aspect of the total deficit is a structural deficit in performance. This is what I think of as the economic climate, because it's with you no matter what the weather is like. This is a permanent consequence of some forces that have come to be known in the trade as the cost disease. And I want to take a moment to explain this just to be sure we're all on the same page, because it's important to what follows. The cost disease does not come from macroeconomic events. It comes from the fact that productivity growth in the performing arts and some other industries is slower or lower than productivity growth in the goods-producing industries. I want to stress that this is not anyone's fault. It's inherent in the nature of performance. If you think about the goods-producing industries, no matter what industry you think of, you can probably think about ways in which technical changes have reduced the labor input over time and hence raised productivity in those industries. When you turn to the performing arts, one notes that the composers, in the case of symphony and classical music, and the playwrights, in the case of the theater, have fixed the ratio of output to input or fixed the labor input for all time. I repeat, the lower productivity growth in the performing arts is just inherent in the nature of performance, and that's why I consider it part of the climate. What's the consequence of this? The consequences has to do with how pay evolves. In the goods-producing sector, over long periods of time, pay tends to increase at the rate of productivity. One consequence of this is increases in pay tend to be offset by increases in output, so there's not, in normal times, huge increased pressure on cost per unit of input. Now, when those same pay increases occur in symphonies or other parts of the art world or universities, they don't have the productivity increases to offset it. The result then is increased costs per performance, increased cost per unit of output. I want to add that this is, again, not unique to the United States. In every country in which I've been able to put together data, you find this phenomena that the cost per performance increases more rapidly than cost per unit of output in the goods-producing sector. The distinction between cyclical and structural deficits is important for two reasons. One I've already touched on. The cyclical deficits are temporary. The structural deficits are with you permanently. It's part of a feature of being involved in the performing arts. As the group Sue, that's my wife's name, as the group Hugh was working with stressed in their final report, the other important aspect of distinguishing between cyclical and structural deficits is they have different policy implications. In the case of cyclical deficits, as most of you know, the key is to, if you can, forecast them, but more importantly, to save during good times, to have the reserves to apply during bad times. When it comes to the structural deficits, orchestras have to think about basic features of their business models and ways of changing them. It is that fact or that task that most of my talk today is going to address. The total deficit encountered by an orchestra is the sum of the structural deficit and the cyclical deficit. The next slide shows you a picture of this. Just to try and clarify. The size of the deficit is on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis portrays time moving from left to right. In the early period, you see, I've stated that there's full employment, and during full employment periods, there is no cyclical deficit. All you have is a structural difference between performance revenues and performance costs. As you move to the right, eventually the economy encounters a recession. You might think of this as the period beginning in late 2007, for example. And to the structural deficit, you add the cyclical deficit to get the total. Eventually, the recession wears down, and when full employment is restored, you once again are left with just the structural deficit. You notice that the important feature of the structural deficit is that it increases over time, which leads me to the second major point that I wish to stress today, and that is that because structural deficits grow over time, even I must say in my work with the OSR data, it's clear that that's the case, even after controlling for cyclical variations in the economy. Because these structural performance deficits grow over time, permanent solutions must grow over time. And as we'll come to see, some of the solutions proposed and used by orchestras provide relief in the year they're applied, but they do not have the feature that they provide additional relief in each subsequent year. There's another aspect of growing structural deficits I think is worth mentioning at least, and that is this term donor fatigue, which seems to have come into vogue the last few years. I've never seen an entirely clear definition of it, and indeed different people may have different definitions. But one thought that seems to underlie its use is that donors are getting tired of being asked for more and more money. Just after they give enough money to take care of one deficit, a symphony is back the next year asking for more. It strikes me that donors that feel that way simply don't understand this crucial feature of structural deficits and raises the question about whether more transparency on the nature of structural deficits in the arts would at least set expectations for donors in a more productive way. One other point I want to come to is that I have sometimes heard when the cost of these dynamics are explained, people say, well, it looks as though society cannot afford the arts because the costs per unit of output are always increasing relative to other sectors. As a matter of analysis, this is not the case. It's simply false. The reason societies can afford the growing money cost of the arts is simply that productivity in the other sectors, the non-art sector, continues to increase. Average productivity in the economy continues to increase with economic growth. And the result is real incomes grow so that the monetary resources to spend money at the arts, even at a higher price, are there. There is, however, the fact that most live performance also requires time, which is worth thinking about, because time, as we all know all too well, is the one budget that doesn't get relaxed. And I'll simply add that the other point in this question of whether society can afford the arts is I've just said it can afford the arts if it chooses to. And one factor that confronts the arts these days that I'll go into is why in many cases smaller proportions of the demographics that typically supported the arts choose to do otherwise. The third of the four general points that I want to go into is the one that takes the longest to develop. This is simply that any policy an orchestra thinks of to deal with the financial challenges must fall under one of three broad strategies. The first two, raising performance revenue growth and reducing performance expense growth, go to the size of the basic performance deficit, the difference between the performance revenues received and the expenses. The third, increasing non-performance income growth, goes to the, goes to the issue of how you cover the performance deficit that remains after pursuing the first two strategies. Now, the important thing about the third of these strategies is that it comes from such diverse sources. You're all familiar with the fact that the non-performance income comes from government, private sources, investment income, and the like. And what's striking about this is the diversity of sources and the diversity of decision-making. In fact, it's precisely because decision-making over non-performance income is so uncoordinated that you have a situation in which there's no guarantee that the non-performance income that comes in any particular year will cover the performance deficit. And indeed, this is what you see in the OSR data when you look at the surplus and deficit position of orchestras over time. Basically, what you observe is that the period 1987 through 2005 that I studied, 46 of the 63 orchestras in the sample averaged a surplus. Another 17 averaged, I'm sorry, I said that backward. The 46 averaged a deficit, 17 averaged a surplus. And when you looked at there was no orchestra that was persistently in a surplus or deficit position. Instead, from year to year, they'd move in and out of surplus and deficit as the somewhat uncertain flow of non-performance income either covered or failed to cover the performance deficit. I think those three broad strategies are obvious to anyone who's been operating with orchestras. What's less obvious, I think, is that none of these strategies alone can produce financial balance. Now that's a conclusion of the study, and what I want to do in most of the rest of the talk is go through the analysis that underlies this conclusion. What I want to do is take each of these three broad strategies that I just listed and talk about their possibilities, but also their limitations in terms of eliminating performance deficits. And in each case, you will see that the conclusion is that none of the strategies alone can do the full job. So turning to strategy one, raising performance revenue growth. This is largely a matter of building and retaining audiences and pricing tickets to increase revenues. The challenges that you face, documented in the book, but I think are probably quite familiar to this audience. One is that attendance overall has been declining, and it is also true that attendance per concert has been declining for most types of classical music. Simply adding more concerts produces diminishing returns in terms of the number of additional attendees. Again, people are surely familiar with that the key demographic for orchestras has, at least recently, been high-income, high-education people. But the unwelcome news is that each successive cohort of this demographic participates less in symphony concerts. And I think this is important, in other arts performances. The reason, and it turns out when you dig a little deeper, in other non-artistic uses of leisure time. This fact seems to me important in thinking about and possibly reframing how you think about symphony's plights. For example, it immediately raises the question of how much of the financial problems encountered by symphonies are unique to orchestras, or the sources are specific to orchestras. What are the limits on orchestra policies? And to what extent, if it's such a broad problem, might collaborations between arts organizations be a useful way to go about dealing with the problems? In my work on what factors influence attendance per concert? Naturally, I looked at first at ticket price levels. There is a trade-off, as usual, between price and attendance, but the demand for classical concerts is fairly price insensitive. So simply increasing a ticket price will increase performance revenue. The less certain aspect of that is many of the people who are patrons of the concerts are also donors. They're a source of the non-performance income. So for the people who don't come because the tickets price rise, an orchestra loses not only the performance revenues, but also whatever their donations would have been. A second aspect is to increase performance revenues is working with ticket price structures so that the people who are most willing to pay get charged relatively high ticket prices, and those who are least relatively willing to pay get charged relatively low prices. This involves discovering the tastes of audiences for seating in different parts of a hall and varying the prices accordingly. There's much opportunity for orchestras with very few ticket price points to benefit from this. For example, as I looked over the orchestras in my league sample, there were a number of orchestras who, judging by the number of price points, had experiment with this quite a bit. There were others that had only 2 to 4 ticket price points, and for those orchestras, there's probably opportunities to raise revenues by varying the ticket price structure more. I also looked at marketing expenditures. As you'd expect, marketing expenditures do raise attendance, but at some point, the expenditures encounter diminishing returns, meaning that each additional expenditure generates smaller and smaller increments of attendance. Part of my interest in adding government data to the OSR data was so that I could explore the effect of a community's economic base on orchestra economics. In the case of attendance per concert, increases in population were associated with higher attendance. And I kind of single this out because one fact that I think that becomes important, and we'll see it in the donated income too, important about community economic characteristics is they're not something that's easily influenced by orchestra policies. To put it differently, there's a real sense in which symphonies have to live with the luck, good or bad, of where they happen to be located in terms of the actual economic capacity of the community to support the orchestra. As I mentioned, I made some effort to explore the influence on attendance in this case in terms of competition with other arts organizations, opera in the case of my book. There was some evidence that if an opera's price relative to the orchestra's ticket price declined, the orchestras would lose a little business. Statistically significant, but the effect was quite small and, in my view, not a big deal at this time. Okay, I said when I introduced these 3 strategies that in tipping you off to the conclusion that none of the strategies would do it alone. In looking at the possibilities for an audience growth strategy, you can understand why orchestras would be drawn to such strategies because on average, the orchestras in my sample sold about 70% of their seats. There's only a very small handful of orchestras that sell out their hall. So I asked of the data the following question. If each of these orchestras could in fact sell out their entire hall, would that eliminate their performance deficit? And the way I asked that question was to make a very optimistic assumption. That is, that they could sell out the empty seats at the existing ticket price. the optimism is obvious because they're not selling those tickets. But taking the optimistic approach, I estimated how much revenue they'd get if they filled every seat at existing ticket prices. And for the vast majority of orchestras, filling every seat in the house would not handle their problem. There's another limitation to the audience growth strategy, and this is more subtle, but recall the second point was the best solutions are solutions that grow with the size of the structural deficit. Now, if you think about an audience growth strategy, it may grow for a while as you move from 70% to 100% of the house, but at some point, the size of the hall is going to limit what one can get out of an audience growth strategy. So there are these two debilities that mean you cannot eliminate performance deficits in the vast majority of cases by solely pursuing an audience growth strategy. That brings me to the second strategy, which is reducing performance expense growth. This is easily the most conflictual of the strategies because so much of the costs of an orchestra are labor costs, which are also the labor incomes of the artistic and non-artistic personnel. Moreover, many of these incomes and costs are established in collective bargaining. And one point I always make in teaching my students about collective bargaining is that the contract, collective bargaining dispute always has two signatures on it. So if you're concerned about any aspect of a collective bargaining agreement, it is as relevant to ask why management agreed to it as to ask why the union pushed for it. What I do in the book is basically to set out some facts that might condition discussions about the growth of wages and, as we'll see, some other aspects of cost. It turns out that since 1987, the first year of the study, the symphony musicians' pay has increased more rapidly on average than pay growth elsewhere in the economy, both in the union and non-unionized sectors of the economy. Collective bargaining agreements have converted artistic expenses from variable to fixed costs. In most years, changes in, I should mention that in comparison to foreign countries, the current pay levels of U.S. orchestra musicians are higher and also place the U.S. musicians in a higher position in our national income distribution than relative to the position of musicians in foreign high-income countries. In most years, the changes in musicians' pay show little sensitivity to the financial balance of their orchestra. Turning from the labor cost, I've already mentioned that expenditures on marketing are subject to diminishing returns. So it's important to assess, once again, the incremental benefits from further expenditures. And then the bottom line question, does slowing the growth of expenses contribute to a permanent solution? And because we're talking about a slowing of the growth rate, the answer is yes. If you can slow the growth rate year after year, it definitely contributes to a permanent solution. But as with the first strategy, there's a limitation to this strategy as well. And that is simply that beyond some point, slowing the growth of labor costs will threaten the ability to retain artistic and non-artistic personnel. So again, in this second strategy, you reach a similar conclusion that slowing expense growth unquestionably can help the situation, but this strategy alone will not completely restore the financial balance. The third strategy is the strategy of increasing non-performance income growth, and we saw there are several sources. I want to start with the government, and the typical view is that other countries support orchestras and other performing arts well, and the U.S. Provides very little support. If you talk about direct subsidies, usually direct production subsidies, the view is absolutely correct. But the U.S. does far more with what I've termed indirect subsidies than other countries. Indirect subsidies are the fact that those of us who contribute to symphonies, other arts, other charitable organizations can deduct those amounts from our taxable income and save the taxes. Economists call these deductions tax expenditures, and when you think about it, it's the right term. It's revenue that the government could have collected and chosen how to spend, but instead lets citizens and businesses spend for specific purposes that are defined in the tax code. The first year of my study, 1987, was a year in which 3/4 of the support received by the orchestras in my sample was in the form of these indirect subsidies. And the other quarter came from direct subsidies like NEA payments. By the end of the study period, 2005, the indirect subsidies accounted for 96% of government support to orchestras. There's several, I think, interesting implications of this, possibly not immediately apparent. The first is that once you start thinking about the tax expenditures and the extent to which symphonies and other arts organizations benefit from them, you realize that the distinction between private and public support really is not all that clear-cut, because some of what is labeled private support in all the reports, in a sense, is a kind of public support that the government has decentralized to individuals and businesses. And this decentralization, I think, is another aspect that contrasts the approach in the United States with the approach in Europe. Here, effectively, the emphasis on indirect support decentralizes decision-making about supportable art to you and I, other individuals, and businesses. In direct subsidy situations, those decisions fall in the hands of government groups or arts elites. And then finally, and most obviously to this group, the future private support depends importantly on national tax policy, and I'll say a few more words about that in the future. In the interest of time, I'm simply going to mention that a second use of direct subsidies could be demand rather than supply, and there's a discussion in the book about the possibilities and potential problems of using arts vouchers to build demand for arts performances, to try and deal with the attendance problem. But I want to go on and give you two quick pictures that contrast the structure of revenues, and in a moment expenses, in an economy with substantial direct government subsidies, that's Australia, and the US economy, which does not use direct subsidies much anymore. What you can see at a glance is that in Australia, the time I'm looking at it, 61% of the revenues came from government support, subsidies. The US slice was so small I couldn't even label it at 5%. The mirror image that almost are the differences in private support, where it's quite a small percentage, obviously, in Australia, much larger in the US, but with the ambiguity I just mentioned, that the distinction between private and government support is, in a sense, fuzzy, given our tax laws. Turning to the comparison expenses, I think the most prominent feature of this comparison to me is that in economies with the huge levels of government support that we saw for Australia, there are categories of expenses that almost don't exist or exist at a much lower level. Fundraising is one. If you have reliable flow from the government, why would you need a fundraising operation? To some extent, marketing expenditures can be reduced. One result of that then is the proportion of expenses that goes to artistic for artistic purposes is much larger. Let me move from government to private support. Not surprisingly, given our discussion a moment ago, government tax policies are all important, and particularly salient as we have this conversation. The U.S. needs to raise revenues, obviously, to balance its budget or try and reduce the deficit. If it raises revenues by raising tax rates, that in a sense is good news for arts organizations because it makes the charitable deduction more valuable. That's probably not, let me put it differently. I don't want to be a political forecaster, but I don't hear a lot of people pushing for increased rates at this point. A more likely part of the discussion is that they would try to raise revenues by narrowing the tax base, which basically means eliminating or restricting some current tax expenditures. Obviously, the worst outcome from a standpoint of arts organizations would be eliminating the charitable deduction. I don't say that's a likely outcome, but it would be a worse one. An intermediate one that's under discussion in some quarters is giving each taxpayer a total money amount of tax expenditure and letting the taxpayers distribute it. Second influence on private support is fundraising activities. Bear in mind that most symphonies survived for 7 or 8 decades without fundraising activities, into the 60s, most cases, so that money obviously flows, support obviously flows into symphonies even without a fundraising operation. The question is, what's the marginal effect of symphonies? In my analysis, I explored this and found that basically fundraising expenditures more than pay for themselves in larger orchestras, but by the late 1980s, there was no reliable effect of fundraising on donations in smaller orchestras. It's an intriguing finding, and I regret to say I'm not sure what the explanation of it is. Community economic characteristics, of course, influence private support. And once again, when I looked at the effect of competition with operas in terms of private support, the effect was significant but very small. Okay. The last source of non-performance income is endowment management. Excuse me. With respect to endowment management, I see 3 sorts of problems that have emerged. First, as background, most endowments are supposed to provide support in perpetuity. And to do that requires a board of trustees to manage an endowment in a way that balances the interests of unrepresented future patrons and musicians against the very well represented interests of current concert patrons and musicians. In order to do this, endowments must also be careful about the particular payout rate that they choose because they face, with reference back to the cost disease, an ever-increasing cost for any functions that they're trying to support. It turns out that when you think about a prudent spending rate, you have to consider not only what you would like to support, but the fact that this is going to increase in future years, so that in future years, the rate of return on your endowment investments has to equal the rate you'd like to draw for real support plus the inflation and costs there. There's an example there, and you can see from the numbers that it doesn't take really very much before you start needing rates of return on your endowment that are way above what the markets are offering. My analysis of the data provided by Orchestras to the League shows that some orchestras had adopted unsustainably high payout rates, meaning they were basically payout rates that would shortchange future patrons and musicians. The second point, broad point on endowments, is that some orchestras' investment policies could be improved. To set this up, realize that financial markets typically offer investors a trade-off between the returns on their investment and the risk. which is the year-to-year volatility in returns on that investment. Efficient in what the trade refers to as efficient investment portfolios obtain the highest return possible for a desired risk level. And unfortunately, by this standard, a lot of the endowment portfolios are not managed very well. Here's a picture that I want to explain that leads me to that conclusion. On the vertical axis, you see the return on endowment investments. On the horizontal axis, you see a measure of investment risk, the year-to-year volatility. What a textbook would tell you about efficient portfolios is you'd see some sort of a positive relationship in the combinations of risk and return for different organizations. Each of those dots you're looking at represents a different orchestra. That is, it represents the combination of return and risk for a different orchestra. And what you can see at a glance is there's no positive relationship. It's more like a random scatter. And if you stare at it long enough, you'll see that at any risk level you choose, there are some orchestras that are earning 5, 10, or even 15% more return than other orchestras. Or if you prefer to control on something like a 5% rate of return, again, you can see at a glance that some orchestras are achieving that by much riskier portfolios, much more volatile portfolios than others. So that basically there's room for improvement in the management of endowment investments. The last thing I asked about endowments was what size of endowment would an orchestra need in order to cover its performance deficit by the earnings on the endowment. And I'm trying to think of the right word. I'll go for astronomical, orders of magnitude larger than current endowments. And there's a more subtle risk if an orchestra pursued that goal, which is it's likely that some of the money that went into the endowment might be diverted from donations that otherwise would have been available for day-to-day operating expenses. So to conclude, none of those three broad strategies by itself can remove deficits. By itself are the important words because each of them obviously contribute to removing a performance deficit, but none of them can do it alone. And to summarize then, the 4 points I said I wanted to develop, first of all, I think in discussing policies, it's important to diagnose what the deficit comes from, whether it's cyclical or structural. Secondly, try to devise permanent solutions, policies that would grow with the deficit. Third, all of the specific policies you might discuss are going to fall under one of three basic strategies, but none of these strategies by itself will cure the structural deficit. All of them have to be in play. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and answers before Bob needs to head off to find an airplane. We have a mic up here in the front of the room. We have a mic in the back of the room. Please indicate your name, your organization, your position, and try to keep your question relatively brief so that everyone will have an opportunity to enter into the discussion. So the mic is open.
Robert Levine, Milwaukee Symphony, and member of the lead board. We did this in the previous section, and I'm kind of auditioning to go on the road with Professor Flanagan for Little Dog and Pony Show. I don't have a basis or any reason to question any of the numbers in the analysis, and certainly I think the analysis is far more thorough and balanced than some of the earlier iterations with the papers that came out. Having said that, my fundamental problem with the underlying thesis is that I think it confuses our funding model with what we really are. We are not, our mission is not to sell tickets to people in our concert halls and make a living off that. In fact, I don't know if you saw, about a year ago, there was an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on nonprofit funding models, and there were 10 listed, and we weren't close to any of them. We have actually quite bizarre funding model, I think, although maybe it's more common in performance nonprofits. But if you recognize us as fundamentally nonprofits and not really as entertainment companies that don't ever seem to manage to close the gap between ticket sales and expenses, then a lot of the problems you talk about don't go away, but they're not structural, they're not inherent the same way. Another way to put that is that orchestras don't actually have to sell tickets at all. It would be an entirely viable choice for an orchestra, although you'd have to figure out how to make it work, to give away your concerts, to go out and play in the community for free, and to raise money to pay for it. And in fact, I suspect some orchestras, if they did the numbers correctly, would actually not have to raise a whole lot more to do that than they have to raise now. But it's inconceivable that you could actually have an orchestra function by just selling tickets. There's no way you could make that happen. We are fundamentally nonprofits, and I think that analysis implicitly views us from the standpoint of an entity that is selling a product to break even or ideally make a profit. I don't think it doesn't work for us. It kind of misses the point. The other thing I wanted to say was about compensation. I'm sure the compensation numbers are accurate, but they aggregate a lot of figures in there that I think the aggregation masks, as it does in general, the fact that you've got a relatively small number of orchestras doing quite well, institutionally, economically, and a lot of orchestras not doing so well. And the Boston Symphony and my orchestra look structurally very the same, but they're actually very, very different organizations, very different relationships to their community. And the BSO, of course, is wildly successful, and my orchestra never has been. And it's not because we're structurally different inside, it's because we function very differently. And I don't think the aggregation is at all helpful to separating that out. It's not an accident that the orchestras that pay the most are typically the ones that are financially the healthiest. Not always, but often. It's not an accident that in real terms, the income of the base salary in Boston Symphony has gone up about 60% over the last 13 years. The base salary in my orchestra has gone down in real terms about 15%. And yet, they get aggregated into your compensation figures, and I think they don't really produce an accurate figure or even terribly helpful in terms of analysis. So.
Okay, as Robert indicated, I've heard these questions once already this afternoon, but my response is the same. I do have trouble getting my head around the first question, not because I really disagree with its premise that the people involved in the arts are there because of the beauty of the arts, but because I don't see how the arts can survive without the economic dimension. And I don't believe that the analysis in the book is in any way divergent from the notion of not-for-profit enterprise. It in fact explains why orchestras and other arts organizations must be not-for-profit organizations. Beyond that, I remain a little puzzled about how to respond to the question, because I don't see how the arts can survive without facing up to the financial issues that I've been discussing. Now, the other question goes to the aggregation of the study, and as I said before, it's an industry study, and it's true. I'm more intrigued by this question because it is true that when I worked with the data, I saw immense variation on almost any dimension of finance that you can mention among individual orchestras. I didn't have time to go into this today. But there is an interesting question of why. Why are the non-performance income sources for different orchestras all over the lot? Why are the structures of revenues and expenditures for so many symphonies very widely dispersed? I didn't go into this for two reasons. One is my agreement with the league is that I not publish any of the individual orchestra data. And the other reason, which goes more to the question as Robert posed it, is exactly how should the symphony sector be divided up if you wanted to disaggregate? When we were talking about this earlier, Robert was suggesting, as he just did now, that there may be fundamental differences between the larger orchestras and the smaller orchestras that are lost in a study that does an industry average. And that's possible, but to try and pursue that, one must have a notion of what are the different pathologies? Why, to make progress with that idea, which I think is an interesting one, you need to have some sense of why the pathology of larger orchestras would be distinctly different from that of smaller orchestras. And that's the part, I think, that remains a puzzle.
Let me just take another whack at the nonprofit. I don't blame you for having a hard time wrapping your head around what I'm saying, because I recognize I'm not saying it very well. I haven't come up with the magic formulation yet. And I think it's an important point, and I'm still wrestling with it. But imagine that our funding model was simply we give away our product, and we go out and raise funds either through endowment over time or just on a year-to-year basis. So we are strictly a nonprofit. We do not have earned revenue, which in fact is a fairly common model for a lot of nonprofits. My wife runs a small nonprofit. That's exactly what they do. They charge nothing to anyone. They raise money to pay for what they provide. Well, all of a sudden you don't have a performance gap because you're not selling tickets. Your limits to fundraising are not fundamentally set by economics in a way. They are really set by the value that the community sets on the service you provide. There's not necessarily, I mean, at some point, obviously, there's a limit on how much you can raise, but it's far more demand-driven than it is driven by the internal economic issues or Baumol's cost disease, for example. And I would suggest that the problem that orchestras are having now, and they are obviously having problems, I've accepted enough concessions over the past 15 years to know that, has much more to do with our relationship to society and our perception in society and how we are valued by our communities than it has to do with the kinds of factors that you raise. I'm not denying that there are issues, but I don't think they're fundamentally ones of internal economics or the kinds of issues that a for-profit company faces, although obviously, it didn't really matter what the internal cost of production was for the buggy whip makers once people stopped wanting buggy whips. And my fear has always been, are we Ford Motor Company or are we Ford Buggy Whips? Because if we're the latter, none of this makes any difference. But if we're the former and there's a real demand for what we do, we'll figure out a way to pay for it.
I think all I can say is that at moments in your description, particularly of another not-for-profit, it almost sounded to me like you had an image of a volunteer symphony orchestra as far as the funding went. And I don't mean to caricature, that's just what I thought I heard. And I guess I'd have to put if that's accurate, I'd have to put myself down as skeptical on that point. With regard to attendance, the population, as I said, was significantly related. A bit of a surprise to me was income per capita of a community was not significantly related. The raw size was the more important. And I suppose that could be because orchestras, to some extent, with deft ticket structure policies, could set ticket prices so that it was available to all income levels. And then, as I mentioned, in addition to that, the ticket pricing was an influence, and there was a tiny influence through competition with operas. But the ticket pricing and the community population were the strongest influences.
I was just curious, you mentioned when you were talking about fundraising expenses that it was important to look at the net of the the cost of raising that money. And I'm wondering if you did any sort of study on the net, on the marketing and ticket sales side. And I think this relates to what this gentleman over here was bringing up, which is I think if you actually look at the total marketing budget plus the personnel associated with generating the ticket sales and also processing the ticket sales, my guess is there isn't much money there. There might be more money there if there are other product lines, presentations, pops, summer, holiday, other things that maybe are less of the core classical product. But I'm just curious if you looked at the ticket revenue in that light.
There were limited, in the marketing study, just to be clear, the study of the effect of marketing expenditures, that pertained to attendance. And the reason I didn't refer to ticket revenue per se, sorry, I didn't use ticket revenue as the dependent variable, was because that information is only available for a very limited number of years. It wasn't available for many of the year. That would be a perfectly valid way to go about it, a perfectly valid thing to explore, but I just ran into a data limitation there. So anything I said about the effects of marketing was on attendance, and then you have to make your own assumption, I guess, about what they're paying.
Hi, I'm Greg Heltman from Santa Fe, New Mexico, Santa Fe Symphony. And looking at your page, Society Can Afford the Arts if it so chooses. My question is, over the last 40 years, we've seen a substantial increase in productivity, yet real incomes have failed to keep pace with that productivity. That combined with the tax policies of the last 10 to 20 years, what significance do you see in the ability of the 90% or less of society of income earners? What impact has that made on the ability of those earners to contribute to the performing arts when their real purchasing power has been significantly diminished since the 70s? And of course, the tax policies make it less desirable to make a contribution because the tax deduction is substantially less.
Well, I think you've almost answered your own question in the sense that with lower real incomes, both attendance and donations, you would expect to decline. And particularly, although as I just said to the previous, in response to two questioners back, you don't see so much an income per capita influence on attendance, but you do definitely see it on donations. So when you look at what affects donations, the income per capita is far more important than the population changes in an area. So, so that basically, I think it makes the non-performance income harder to raise, unquestionably, and the lower tax rates of the period also make the well, I'll put it this way, provide less incentive for people to donate. So your instinct that the best thing that could happen to the arts in general, and symphonies in particular, would be renewed growth of real income and an increase in tax rates is correct.
Hi, my name is Richard Neitz, and I'm from Denver, Colorado. I'm a conductor, musician, and also working on my PhD in research and policy. So, the question I had was under strategy 2, you mentioned that musicians' pay has increased more rapidly than pay grows elsewhere. Are there any other areas in which pay expenses have grown since '87, such as administrative costs of orchestras, cost for instance, venues, and how does that relate to musicians' pay?
Yeah, the only, I have musicians' pay because ICSOM publishes it for the whole period. Unfortunately, the same is not true of administrative pay. What I have in the, I think it's chapter 6 of the book, is a comparison of the pay of administrative personnel to both the bass musician wage and a concertmaster's wage and so on. But it's a one-time photograph. I haven't come up with any series that shows how that pay has evolved over time. As a pay rate, when you look at the OSR reports, you have data on total administrative expenses, but you don't know how many people are involved or what their salary is, so you can't create the same comparison that you can for the wage rates.
Bob, do I remember or misremember that you had some data on guest artist costs through time?
Yeah, this again comes out of the OSR reports, but it's not per artist again. It's total expenditure on guest artists, and I explored that, and that accounts. I once read a book that claimed the entire problem with orchestras is the amount they spent on soloists, and that was before I had the data, and my skepticism was reinforced by the data. It's not that the soloists don't cost a certain amount, but I think you're talking about 10%, if memory serves, of total artistic expenses, which would be about 5% of total expenses of an orchestra. But I'd have to check that, but it's the right ballpark, I think.
Hi, I'm Declan McGovern from the BBC and the Ulster Orchestra in Northern Ireland. I have read your book. It's a brilliant piece of work, I think, and I've also read Jesse's reading of the book. I mean, I think it's full of very rich analysis, and I know you're an economist, and I wonder how you would turn all this rich analysis into actions if you were a fundraiser. So to pick up on one line in particular, some donor fatigue may reflect a misunderstanding of the inherent feature of deficits in the performing arts. You know, when you talked about the difference between structural and cyclical deficits, and if we're better at explaining that, maybe we can get more people to donate. But in terms of your observations, how would you actually incentivize donors? How would you get rid of donor fatigue, having uncovered the observations and the analysis that you now have to hand? If you were in that position of being a fundraiser.
Okay, it's a good question. I cannot answer it I will give you an answer, but it's not based on the book. It's more experiences I've had writing the book, okay? And the terse form of the answer is I would increase the amount of transparency that orchestras have with all their constituents, their patrons, their donors, and so on. It may seem like a strange answer, but as I have worked on this initially as an outsider, I have been surprised at the lobby for lack of transparency at times. For example,
sharing financial figures with customers or supporters?
Or even publishing papers that showed that everything was not terrific financially secure in the orchestra sector. The kind of comment I got, for what it's worth, and this is from the management side at times, was we don't want people to think we're losers. If they think we're losers, they won't donate to us. I think that's fundamentally wrong, and I can even offer some pieces of evidence to counter it. First of all, that view that I just expressed is absolutely the opposite of what universities and other cost disease industry do when they're in trouble. When we went into the recent recession, university presidents, I'm not saying all of them, but many of them, wrote very forthright messages explaining why the endowments had taken the hit they did, demonstrating that the consequences of generally good management in most of their cases, and asked their supporters to try and respond even though they were tough times. As far as the arts goes, if there are people who still have doubts about the relevance of transparency, I would encourage them to read about the Peter Gelb fiasco in New York City a couple of weeks ago. It starts on the front page of the New York Times and continues. This is a situation where the manager of the New York Opera tried to censor the opera news from writing reviews of operas presented by the New York Opera. As you might surmise, they had not been getting great reviews. Within a maximum of 10 hours, that policy had been reversed due to the flood of email. And I encourage people who have doubts about the transparency issue to go to the New York Times and read the stream of comments that the initial article generated. Part of donor fatigue, I said, is misunderstanding of the structural deficit. I think that's the case. Part of it, I believe, from things I've heard from donors, is fatigue with being misled, and perhaps worse than that.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Last question, please.
My name is Gregory Isaacs. I'm now with the press, but at a time in the past, I was working with an opera company, and we were making a speech one time to donors and say, X number of percent of the ticket price we have to raise, by donors, and it struck me at that exact moment that we're just saying this exactly backwards. That what we needed to say was that you're donating money to underwrite the ticket price so that it doesn't have to be this very high price, like if you went to see Phantom of the Opera, which is a for-profit opera, and we turned this exactly backwards, and so we had a chart of ticket price and donations. And as the donations went up, the ticket price went down. And all of a sudden, we had all the donations we wanted. People, suddenly they were not giving us money so we could put on an opera. All of a sudden, they realized that they were underwriting the ticket price so that it was affordable to the general public. And that switch flipped in their brain, and we met all of our fundraising goals as long as we came up with that pitch. But back when we were saying 40% of it to put this on has to come from your donation, they would say, well, put one on that's only 60% is costly. But when we flipped the switch and let them know that what they were actually doing was underwriting the ticket price so that their neighbors and their friends could afford to go instead of $300 for a seat at some touring musical, it was amazing to see the switch in their brain. So I think many times we're our own worst enemy out there begging for money so that we can do what we want to do. And I think if we turn it around and say, we're bringing this to you, the public, and you're going to underwrite the cost so that it's affordable to the average person, it made a tremendous difference.
You've convinced me that a full study of the symphony sector should involve a psychologist as well as an economist.
And on that note, thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Pleasure. Thank you.